Sarah's headlights cut through the suffocating darkness of Route 49, the only illumination for miles in either direction, as she drove through the desolate stretch of highway that carved its way between ancient pine forests and forgotten farmland. The radio had given up its signal 20 miles back, leaving her alone with the hypnotic hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional creak of her aging Honda as it struggled against the October wind that seemed to push back against her progress with malevolent intent. She checked her phone again. No signal, just the mocking display of 11:47 p.m. and a battery hovering dangerously close to 15%. Not that it mattered, since she was still 3 hours from home and had foolishly declined her sister's offer to stay the night after the funeral, insisting she could make the drive despite everyone's warnings about the treacherous mountain roads and the late hour. The funeral had been for her great-aunt Millicent, a woman Sarah barely knew but felt obligated to honor, and the service had run longer than expected when the ancient pastor had launched into an interminable sermon about the thin veil between worlds and how some souls refused to rest, words that now echoed uncomfortably in her mind as she navigated the serpentine curves of a road that seemed to grow narrower and more oppressive with each passing mile. A sudden thump from beneath her car made her heart skip, probably just a pothole, she told herself, but when she glanced in her rearview mirror, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat, a procession of figures walking single file along the shoulder of the road, their forms barely visible but unmistakably human, moving with a slow, deliberate gait that seemed synchronized in a way that defied natural explanation. She slowed the car, squinting into the darkness, but when she looked again, the figures had vanished, leaving her to wonder if exhaustion and grief were playing tricks on her mind as she pressed the accelerator and tried to convince herself that what she'd seen was nothing more than shadows cast by swaying tree branches. The next exit sign appeared in her headlights like a salvation, Millbrook Cemetery, 2 miles, and though the name sent an uncomfortable chill down her spine, she decided to pull off and collect herself, maybe grab a few minutes of rest before continuing the journey home. The exit ramp descended into a valley shrouded in mist that seemed to glow with its own pale luminescence, and as she followed the winding road toward what she assumed would be a small town, or at least a gas station, she instead found herself approaching the wrought iron gates of an enormous cemetery that stretched beyond the reach of her headlights, its weathered headstones and elaborate mausoleums creating a cityscape of the dead that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. She parked near the entrance, leaving the engine running and the doors locked, but as she sat there trying to calm her racing heart, she noticed that the mist was moving in patterns that defied the wind, swirling around certain graves in tight spirals before dissipating and reforming around others, as if drawn by some invisible force that operated according to rules she couldn't comprehend. The temperature inside the car began to drop despite the heater running at full blast, and her breath started to fog the windows, creating condensation that seemed to form shapes and symbols before her trembling hand could wipe them away. That's when she saw them again, the procession of figures, now clearly visible as they emerged from the cemetery gates and began walking along the road in the same methodical formation she'd witnessed earlier, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods but their movements coordinated with the precision of a ritual that had been performed countless times before. She fumbled for her phone to call for help, but the screen remained black despite her frantic pressing of buttons, and when she turned the key to restart the engine, nothing happened, not even the clicking sound of a dead battery, just an ominous silence that seemed to amplify every other sound around her, the whisper of wind through bare branches, the soft shuffle of approaching footsteps, and a low humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The figures were closer now, close enough that she could see they weren't walking on the road at all, but hovering several inches above it, their feet never quite touching the ground as they glided forward with supernatural grace, and as they passed her car, each figure turned its head toward her with movements that were too smooth and too deliberate to be human. The first face she saw beneath a hood was that of an elderly woman, with skin like parchment, and eyes that reflected her headlights like mirrors, but it was the second face that made her scream, her great-aunt Millicent, looking exactly as she had in the casket that morning, her lips moving in what might have been words of greeting or warning. Sarah pressed herself against the driver's seat, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst, as more faces revealed themselves, strangers from decades past based on their clothing and hairstyles, but all sharing the same ethereal pallor and that terrible, knowing expression that suggested they were aware of something she couldn't understand. The procession seemed endless, stretching back into the cemetery and forward into the darkness beyond, and as it continued to pass her car, Sarah realized with growing horror that she recognized more of the faces, distant relatives from old family photographs, people she'd never met but whose features echoed her own in ways that spoke of shared bloodlines and inherited destinies. The humming grew louder, resolving into what sounded like a funeral dirge sung in harmony by voices that had long since left the world of the living, and the mist began to swirl around her car in tighter and tighter circles until she could barely see beyond the windows. She tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge, as if the car itself had become part of the supernatural machinery that governed this place, and when she pressed her face against the window to look for an escape route, she saw that the cemetery gates were now standing wide open,
revealing a path lined with flickering lanterns that led deeper into the necropolis than should have been possible given the size of the property she'd observed from the road. The procession was changing direction now, turning toward the open gates with movements that remained unnaturally synchronized, and as they began to file through the entrance, each figure paused to look back at her car with expressions that seemed to beckon her to follow. The temperature continued to drop until frost began forming on the inside of her windows, and her breath came in ragged puffs that immediately crystallized in the supernatural cold that had invaded her vehicle, making her fingers numb and her thoughts sluggish as hypothermia began to set in despite the October weather outside being merely cool rather than freezing. She could hear her phone buzzing now, impossibly, since it had shown no signs of life moments before, and when she managed to pick it up with shaking hands, the screen displayed dozens of missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, all placed at times that hadn't happened yet. Calls from 2:30 a.m., 3:15 a.m., 4:45 a.m., and when she tried to answer one of the incoming calls, she heard her own voice on the other end, desperate and pleading, begging someone to help her escape from a place called Millbrook Cemetery. The procession had mostly passed through the gates now, but the last figure in line was different from the others, younger, wearing modern clothes, and when it turned to face her, Sarah saw her own reflection looking back, her own face bearing the same ethereal pallor and knowing expression as the others, her own lips moving in the same soundless communication that seemed to transcend the barriers between life and death. The figure that wore her face raised one hand and beckoned, and Sarah felt an overwhelming compulsion to leave the car and join the procession, to take her place in the endless line of souls that had been drawn to this place by forces older than memory and more powerful than death itself. She fought against the urge, pressing her palms against her ears to block out the funeral dirge that was growing louder and more insistent, but the sound seemed to come from inside her head now, from inside her very bones, as if it had always been there waiting for the right moment to emerge and claim her. The car door opened by itself, and the October air that rushed in carried the scent of freshly turned earth, and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded her of the flowers that had surrounded her great-aunt's casket, lilies and roses that had been beautiful in the daylight but now seemed to carry the corruption of the grave. She tried to grab the steering wheel to anchor herself to something solid and real, but her hands passed through it as if it were made of smoke, and she realized with dawning terror that she was already changing, already becoming something other than what she had been when she first saw the procession on the highway. Her feet touched the ground outside the car, and she felt the same floating sensation she'd observed in the other figures, as if gravity had loosened its hold on her, and she was being drawn upward by invisible strings controlled by a puppet master, whose intentions she couldn't fathom, but whose power she couldn't resist. The procession had stopped just inside the cemetery gates, waiting for her, and as she approached them with movements that felt both foreign and familiar, she understood that this wasn't the first time she'd walked this path, that some part of her had always known she would end up here, that the funeral that morning hadn't been an ending but a beginning, a summoning that had called her home to a place she'd never seen but had always belonged to. The other figures welcomed her with silent nods and gestures that spoke of recognition and acceptance, and as she took her place in line between her great-aunt Millicent and a woman who looked remarkably like her grandmother, she felt a sense of peace settle over her that was more profound than anything she'd ever experienced in life, a feeling of completeness that came from finally understanding her purpose and her destiny. The procession began moving again, deeper into the cemetery along paths that wound between elaborate monuments and simple headstones, past mausoleums that glowed with their own internal light and crypts whose doors stood open as if their occupants had simply stepped out for a midnight stroll, and with each step Sarah felt herself becoming more integrated into the collective consciousness that guided the group, her individual thoughts and memories merging with theirs, until she could no longer distinguish between her own experiences and those of the countless others who had walked this path before her. They were heading toward the center of the cemetery, where an ancient oak tree stood surrounded by a circle of standing stones that predated the graves around them by centuries, its massive trunk carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the flickering light of the lanterns that had appeared along their route. And as they approached this sacred space, Sarah understood that this was where the ceremony would take place, where her transformation would be completed, and she would take her place among the eternal guardians of this threshold between worlds. The tree's branches reached toward a sky that was no longer dark but filled with swirling colors that had no names in any living language, auroras of impossible beauty that painted the cemetery in hues of violet and gold, and deep crimson that pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat that might have belonged to the earth itself, or to something far older and more vast than any mortal mind could comprehend. The procession formed a circle around the oak tree, and Sarah found herself standing directly beneath its canopy, looking up through branches that seemed to extend infinitely upward into a cosmic void where stars spelled out messages in constellations that changed even as she watched them, their meaning just beyond her grasp but somehow familiar, as if she had read these stellar scriptures before in dreams she couldn't quite remember. The humming reached a crescendo that vibrated through every molecule of her being, and she felt herself beginning to dissolve, her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her physical form to encompass the entire cemetery, the sleeping souls beneath the earth, the whispered secrets of the wind, and the eternal dance of death and rebirth that governed all existence. And in that moment of transcendence she finally understood that she had never been driving home from a funeral but toward one her own, and that the life she thought she'd been living had been nothing more than a dream,
a temporary illusion that had held her spirit while it prepared for this moment of awakening, this return to the eternal procession that had been calling her name since the day she was born. And as the last vestiges of her mortal identity faded away like morning mist, she took her place among the guardians of the threshold, forever bound to walk the midnight highways and guide other lost souls to their own moment of terrible, beautiful revelation, her headlights now just another pair of eyes watching from the darkness as the next traveler approached the exit sign for Millbrook Cemetery, her voice just another whisper in the wind, warning them to turn back while they still could, though she knew as surely as the sun would rise that they wouldn't listen, that they couldn't listen, because the procession was always in need of new members, and the road that led to the cemetery was really the road that led away from everything else, and once you started walking it, there was no going back to the world of the living, only forward into the eternal night where the dead dance beneath stars that have forgotten how to shine.